I need to check the use names list carefully, then write the story. The band names are Eleanor, Diane, Rosie, Marcus, Catherine, Valerie, Patricia, Susan, Judith, Gerald, Lynette, Bonnie, Nora, Kevin, Amber, Lily, Priscilla, Frank, Walt, Irene, Charlotte, Raymond, Stephanie, Dorothy, Richard, Mr. O. Hendricks, Beverly, Hazel, Helen Biscuit. I'll use Margaret. No, wait, that was in the original video. I'll use completely fresh names. Ruth, narrator, Arthur, millionaire, Donna, daughter, Caleb, grandson, Miriam, housekeeper, Sandra, antagonist's sister. The snow started falling over Portland the same morning the hospital called to tell me my grandson needed a new heart. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, still holding my coffee mug, watching the flakes collect on the windowsill. 17 years I'd lived in that house. Raised my daughter there after her father passed. Planted the rose bush by the front steps the summer I retired from teaching. And in that moment, none of it felt like anything at all. My grandson was 9 years old. His name was Caleb. He had a gap between his front teeth and a laugh that filled up whatever room he was in, and the doctors at OHSU were telling me that without a transplant and the surgery and the medications and the follow-up care, his heart would give out within the year. My daughter, Donna, sat across from me at that hospital table and didn't cry. She was past crying. She'd been doing the math for weeks. The transplant and total care package, somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. Our insurance had already denied the claim twice. Donna's ex-husband was gone. Her salary as a dental hygienist covered rent and groceries and not much else. I had my teacher's pension, a savings account with $41,000 in it, and a house I could maybe sell for $160,000 if the market held. It wasn't enough. We both knew it. I started a GoFundMe the next day. By the end of the first month, we'd raised $11,000, most of it from people at my old school and my church. It was generous. It was nowhere near enough. I was at the hospital gift shop buying Caleb a book about space. He wanted to be an astronaut, this tiny boy with a broken heart, when a woman I didn't recognize handed me an envelope and walked away before I could say a word. Cream-colored, thick paper, my name written in the kind of handwriting you don't see anymore. Mrs. Ruth Calloway, I understand your situation. I have a proposal that may be of mutual benefit. Please come to Whitmore House, 14 Crescent Bluff Road, this Thursday at 3 in the afternoon. Come alone. This is a legitimate business matter. Edward Whitmore. I stood there in the gift shop holding that envelope and my grandson's space book and tried to remember how to breathe. Everyone in our part of Oregon knew the name Whitmore, or knew of it. Edward Whitmore had inherited the estate from his father sometime in the 90s and had barely been seen since. The house sat up on the bluff above the river, all stone and dark windows, and the stories about the man inside it depended entirely on who was doing the telling. Some said he was disfigured. Some said he was agoraphobic. The version I'd heard most often from people at the library auxiliary was simply that he was a recluse who had more money than he knew what to do with and no interest in the rest of the world. I Googled his name that night after Donna went home. There wasn't much. A brief mention in a 2001 Portland Business Journal piece about a civil engineering firm. Property records. A handful of donations to the Oregon Food Bank and a Children's Literacy Foundation listed under a family trust. No photographs, no social media, nothing after 2004. I almost didn't go. Donna didn't know I was going. I told her I had a dentist appointment. I drove my Subaru up the winding road to Crescent Bluff on a Thursday afternoon in February with the heater running and my hands gripping the wheel and tried to talk myself out of it twice. I kept thinking about Caleb asking me last week if the doctors could fix him. I kept thinking about what I'd told him. Of course they can, sweetheart. That's what doctors do. I hadn't been able to look him in the eye when I said it. The woman who opened the door at Whitmore House was in her 60s, sturdy and sharp-eyed, with the manner of someone who had been running a household for decades and had opinions about how it ought to be done. She introduced herself as Miriam and told me Mr. Rebider. Whitmore was expecting me, and would I like to wait in the sitting room? The house was not what I'd expected. I think I'd imagined something neglected, dusty, the physical expression of a man who'd given up on the world. Instead, it was immaculate. Old furniture, beautifully kept. Bookshelves that ran floor to ceiling in every room I passed through. Fresh flowers on a side table in the hallway. It felt less like a home and more like a very well-maintained archive. Beautiful. Silent. Nothing quite lived in. I waited 15 minutes. I was starting to feel foolish when I heard footsteps on the stairs. The man who walked into that sitting room was not what I pictured either. He was tall, probably late 60s, with gray at his temples, and the posture of someone who'd spent decades being the most competent person in any given room. He was dressed simply, dark slacks, a dark sweater, but what I noticed immediately, without quite meaning to, were his hands. He wore thin gray gloves, indoors. In February, yes, but the house was warm. He made no move to remove them and offered no explanation. His eyes were very still, the kind of still that costs something. Mrs. Calloway, thank you for making the trip. He didn't extend his hand. He gestured toward a chair and took one across for me, leaning forward slightly with his elbows on his knees. I'll be straightforward with you, he said. I've looked into your situation. Your grandson needs a heart transplant and comprehensive post-surgical care. The total cost is approximately $280,000. I'd like to pay for it. I just stared at him. In exchange, he continued, I need a wife. The words sat in the air between us. I think I laughed, actually. A short, disbelieving sound. A legal wife, he said. Temporary. 1 year. You would live here, attend social functions with me as my spouse, and present as my wife to anyone who asks. In return, I'll fund your grandson's treatment in full, beginning immediately. Monthly living expenses during the arrangement. And a lump sum of $40,000 when the year ends and we file for divorce. I asked him why. He was ready for the question. My father's estate is substantial, he said. My younger sister is contesting the will on the grounds that I'm mentally unfit to manage it, that I live in seclusion, that I'm unstable, that I've disengaged from society to a degree that constitutes incapacity. If I can demonstrate a normal life, a marriage, a social presence, engagement with the community, her case collapses. Once the legal matter is resolved, we separate quietly. Why me specifically? He looked at me steadily. You were a school teacher for 34 years. You're known in your community. You're recently widowed, which simplifies things. You have no romantic entanglements, and you're in enough of a crisis that you'll take this seriously rather than treating it like an opportunity to renegotiate mid-year. That last part stung. He meant it to be honest, not cruel. I could tell the difference. I'd taught middle school for 3 decades. I knew what cruel looked like, what would be expected of me. Your own bedroom. No physical relationship. Attendance at 4 or 5 formal events over the course of the year. Charity dinners, a foundation gala, the occasional community function. Meals together when necessary for appearances. Cordial conversation when we're in public. He paused. You can see your grandson and your daughter whenever you like. I can arrange for Caleb's care team to work out of OHSU so he doesn't have to travel. What about your hands? I don't know why I said it. It just came out. Something crossed his face. Not anger. More like the expression of a man who has learned to absorb a particular kind of impact. That's not part of the negotiation, he said. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. Then I called Donna. She said no before I finished explaining. Then she said, "Mom, you can't." Then she was quiet for a long time and said, "Is he dangerous?" I told her I didn't think so. She said, "That's not the same as knowing." I said, "I know." We sat on the phone not talking for a while. Then she said, "If it were me, I'd do it." And I said, "I know that too." I called Edward Whitmore's attorney the next morning. The contract was 42 pages. I had my own attorney look at it, a woman from my church who did estate law and owed me a favor from when I'd tutored her son through algebra. She spent 2 days on it and came back and said the protections were real. The payment structure was solid, the exit clauses were fair to both parties, and she'd never seen a prenuptial adjacent document this thorough in her life. "He's either very careful or very afraid of being taken advantage of," she said. "Maybe both." I signed it on a Tuesday. We were married the following Thursday in a 10-minute civil ceremony at the Multnomah County Courthouse with Miriam and Edward's attorney as witnesses. I wore my navy dress, the one I bought for my retirement dinner. Edward wore a dark jacket and those gloves. When the judge said we could exchange rings, he had a simple gold band ready for me. He slid it onto my finger carefully, with that gloved hand, and his face was so neutral it almost hurt to look at. He didn't kiss me. He nodded. That was that. I moved into Whitmore House that afternoon. Miriam showed me my rooms on the second floor, a bedroom, a small sitting area, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub I privately thought was the nicest thing I'd ever seen. Everything was clean and quiet and impersonal, like a very good hotel. She told me Edward took breakfast at 7:30 and dinner at 6:30 and spent most of his time on the third floor in his office, and preferred not to be interrupted unless something was urgent. She told me he had groceries delivered and handled his own correspondence and that she came in 5 days a week. I asked her if he always wore the gloves. She didn't answer right away. She smoothed an already smooth pillowcase and said, "Yes, ma'am, always." "Do you know why?" "I've worked here 11 years, she said. "I've never asked." The first check to OHSU cleared 2 days after the wedding. Caleb's surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Donna called me crying. The good kind of crying, the kind that sounds like relief. And I sat on the edge of my bed in my new room in this stranger's house and let myself cry too, quietly, into my own sleeve so no one could hear. Edward and I barely spoke that first month. Breakfast was a ritual of parallel silence, him with the Wall Street Journal, me with my phone checking Caleb's latest labs. We established a kind of choreography without discussing it. He'd have Miriam set the table for two. We'd eat. He'd ask how Caleb was doing and actually listen to the answer, which surprised me every time. Then he'd go upstairs and I wouldn't see him until dinner. There were 2 events in the first month: a donor reception at the Oregon Historical Society and a dinner at a colleague of his father's. For both, he came to my door at the appointed time, offered his arm, gloved, and we walked in together. He was good at it. I'll give him that. Pleasant, composed. He introduced me smoothly, laughed at the right moments, touched my elbow when steering me towards someone new in a way that looked natural and felt careful. In the car afterward, he debriefed me on who we'd spoken to and what I'd need to remember. "You're good at this," I told him after the second event. "I was socialized," he said. "I just choose not to be, normally. Why?" He watched the road. "It's easier." I let it go. I'd learned in 34 years of teaching when to push and when to wait. The library on the second floor became my territory. I'd spend afternoons there, reading, and occasionally he'd come down for a reference book and we'd exchange a few sentences. He noticed what I was reading. He started leaving books on the small table by my sitting room door. A Hilary Mantel I'd mentioned wanting to read. Then a history of the Pacific Northwest I hadn't asked for but devoured in 2 days. Then a slim collection of essays about education that made me feel, strangely, seen. I never saw him leave them. I never thanked him directly. We just both understood what was happening. I also started noticing things. He never touched surfaces directly. Door handles, light switches, his coffee cup, always through the gloves. At dinner he ate carefully, slowly, and occasionally I caught a particular stillness in him that I recognized from years of watching children in pain try not to show it. Some nights I could hear him moving around above me, pacing long after the house had gone dark. I was in the kitchen one morning when Miriam was cleaning, and I asked her, carefully, the way you ask a question you've been sitting with for weeks, what had happened to him. She stopped what she was doing. She looked at the window. She said, "I've wondered myself, ma'am. I think it was something from his career before he came here, but he's never said a word about it and I wouldn't know how to ask." His sister arrived on a Wednesday in April. I was in the front sitting room working on a letter to my old school's PTA when I heard the door open, not the careful way Miriam opened it, but the way someone opens a door to make a point. The woman who walked in was probably 60, trim and polished in the way that takes sustained effort, and she looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided to disbelieve. "So you're the teacher," she said. "He actually did it." I set down my pen. "Can I help you?" "Sandra Whitmore, his sister." She didn't extend her hand either. Apparently a family trait. "He's paying you, isn't he? To be here. To play the part. I think you should call ahead next time." She stepped closer. "I want you to know that I'm aware of exactly what this is, and I'm going to prove it. My brother has been hiding in this house for 20 years because of what he did. And no amount of hired companionship is going to convince a judge that he's a functioning member of society. What he did." Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. "Ask him," she said. "Ask him about the bridge." Edward's voice came from the doorway behind me. It was the flattest I'd ever heard him speak. Just Sandra's name, once, like a period at the end of a sentence. His face was composed, but his shoulders were very still. She looked at him for a long moment, then at me. "He'll tell you I'm doing this for money." "The truth is, I'm doing it because I'm the only one who ever told him the truth about himself." She picked up her bag. "Miriam can see me out." After she left, I turned around. Edward was still in the doorway. His face had gone the color of old paper. I didn't ask about the bridge. Not that night. He went upstairs. I heard him walking for a long time. It was 3 in the morning when I woke to a sound I knew from 40 years of living, the specific crack of something heavy and ceramic hitting hardwood. I lay still for a moment. Then I got up. His office door was half open, which I suspected was not usual. Inside, Edward was kneeling on the floor beside a broken lamp, trying to gather the pieces with his hands. He'd taken the gloves off. I understood immediately why he always wore them. His hands were a landscape of damage. The scarring ran from his knuckles to his wrists on both sides. Thick, pale scar tissue layered over what had clearly been extensive burns. His fingers were not quite right. 2 of them angled slightly, the joints on the right hand swollen and fixed in a way that told me the damage went deep into the connective tissue. These weren't old surgical scars. They were the hands of someone who had been in a fire and either could not or would not allow them to heal fully. "Please don't," he said. He was looking at the floor. "Don't what?" "Whatever you're about to say." I sat down on the floor across from him. I'd kneeled on enough gymnasium floors in my career that I'd lost my squeamishness about it. I picked up a piece of the lamp. "Tell me about the bridge," I said. He was quiet for so long, I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I was a structural engineer. Bridges, mostly. Large infrastructure." He stopped. 22 years ago, I signed off on a report that said a pedestrian bridge in a development project in eastern Oregon was sound. It had problems. I knew it had problems. I was under pressure from the project developer and I was behind schedule, and I told myself the issues were within acceptable variance. He stopped again. 8 months after the bridge opened, a section of the railing failed. A family was walking across. The father and the daughter went into the water. The father survived. The girl was 7. The room was very quiet. The investigation determined the failure was caused by the exact stress concentration I'd flagged in my original notes and then minimized in my final report. I wasn't criminally charged. The developer carried most of the liability. But I knew what I'd done. "And your hands?" He looked at them. "I was at the site 6 weeks after the accident. There was a fire, someone's campfire on the riverbank that got out of control. I went toward it instead of away." A long pause. I told the hospital it was an accident. I told myself the same thing for a long time. That's not something you can tell yourself forever. No. His voice was barely anything. It isn't. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "What did the father say?" "At the investigation?" "I don't know." I couldn't look at him. "You've been punishing yourself for 22 years for not looking at him. I killed his daughter. A structural failure killed her. You made a wrong decision under pressure and you've never let yourself stop paying for it." I wasn't being kind. I'd had too many students sit across from me and catalog their own worthlessness for me to offer empty comfort. Those aren't the same thing, Edward. They feel the same. They're not the same. He looked up at me then for the first time. His eyes were red and dry, the eyes of a man who'd stopped knowing how to cry some time ago. "Let me see your hands," I said. "Ruth, I was a licensed CPR instructor for 30 years. I've taken hand injury workshops. Just let me look." Slowly, he held them out. I turned them over carefully. The scarring was severe but old. The joint damage in the 2 fixed fingers on his right hand was long consolidated. Nothing acute. What I could feel was that the tissue around his wrists was still tight, still limiting his range of motion in ways that had probably never been properly addressed. "You need a hand therapist," I said, "not a surgeon. A specialist in scar tissue and joint mobility. There's a practice at OHSU that works with burn survivors. I'm going to make you an appointment. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." I set his hands down gently and looked at him. "I'm your wife, even if it's only on paper right now." Something happened in his face when I said that. Not a smile, exactly. Something quieter. He started therapy 6 weeks later. I drove him to the first 3 appointments because he didn't ask, but I could see he needed someone too. By the 4th, he was going himself. His range of motion in the right hand improved enough within 2 months that he could hold a coffee cup without the gloves when he chose to. He didn't always choose to. Old habits have their own weight, but sometimes in the evenings in the library they were off, and he'd turn pages with those scarred, imperfect hands, and I'd pretend not to notice, and he'd pretend not to notice me pretending, and it felt almost like something real. Caleb's surgery was in May. I was at the hospital with Donna for 11 hours. Edward texted me updates the whole time, not sentimental ones, just "Any news?" and "Let me know when he's out." When I finally texted him that Caleb was in recovery and everything had gone well, he responded after a moment, "Good, go be with your daughter." I cried in the hospital bathroom for 5 minutes and then went and held Donna's hand. Sandra filed her legal motion in June. Her attorneys had done their work. They'd found people willing to say Edward was antisocial, erratic, that our marriage had appeared sudden and convenient, that he'd never been seen in town before I arrived. They had a psychological evaluation done by a professional who had never met Edward but was willing to offer opinions about seclusion and social incapacity. Edward stopped eating properly. The hand therapy regressed. He'd come to dinner with that careful blankness he'd had when we first met, the months of cautious ease we built together seeming to drain out of him. One night, I found him standing in the library at midnight, not reading, just standing. "What happens if she wins?" he asked. What happens to the estate? The foundations. My father set up 3 charitable trusts, one for rural school libraries in Eastern Oregon, one for bridge safety research, one for children who lose a parent in infrastructure accidents. He said it quietly, like he was reading from a list he'd memorized long ago. Sandra will dissolve them within a year. She'll sell the property and distribute the assets. She's told me as much. The bridge safety research. The children who lose a parent in accidents. I understood then what he'd been doing up here for 20 years. Not hiding. Paying a different kind of debt. Then we don't let her win, I said. The hearing was in September, 3 weeks before the end of our year. Sandra's attorneys were skilled and they used everything they had. They describe Edward as a man so psychologically damaged by guilt and grief that he'd isolated himself from all human contact, who'd paid a vulnerable widow to pose as his wife, who had no authentic relationships and no genuine capacity for them. They had photographs, ones that showed Edward entering and leaving the house alone over years. No social contact documented. They had my financial situation laid out in detail. They made it sound like a transaction because it had been, at least at the beginning. Then our side went. Miriam testified. She talked about how Edward had started coming down for dinner instead of having Miriam bring a tray up. She talked about the books left by my door. She talked about the night I'd gone to his office and what she'd heard. Not the details, just that something had shifted in that house, something real. Caleb's cardiologist testified about Edward's involvement in her grandson's case, the calls he'd made, the specialists he'd consulted on her behalf, the follow-up questions that reflected genuine concern and clear-headed judgment. The mayor of our county testified that he'd spoken with Edward at 2 separate events over the past year and found him engaged, thoughtful, and fully present. I took the stand last. Sandra's attorney asked me directly if I'd entered into a financial arrangement with Edward Whitmore in exchange for my grandson's medical care. I looked at Edward. He was sitting at the table with his hands folded in front of him, the gloves off today, those scarred hands visible to the whole room. He was looking at me. His face was completely still. "Yes," I said. "That's how it started. So your marriage is a financial transaction. My marriage started as one. What it is now is something different. Can you describe what it is now?" I thought about the books left by my door without acknowledgement. About the texts during Caleb's surgery. About a man kneeling on his office floor at 3 in the morning with his hands exposed for the first time in years, finally telling someone what he'd done. About the Bridge Safety Trust. About the way he'd said, "Go be with your daughter," when I'd needed someone to tell me it was all right to stop managing everything for 5 minutes. "It's a marriage," I said. "I don't need to prove to you what it feels like. I know what it is." I turned to the judge. Edward Whitmore has spent 20 years trying to make right a decision he made in 30 seconds under pressure. He's funded research that has changed bridge inspection protocols in 4 states. He supported the families of children killed in infrastructure failures. He mentors young engineers through an anonymous foundation his father set up. And yes, he struggles. He carries something heavy and he's been carrying it alone, and that kind of weight changes a person. I looked back at Sandra. But isolated is not the same as incompetent. Grief is not the same as incapacity. And a man who has spent 2 decades quietly making amends is not a man who needs to be saved from himself. The judge ruled in Edward's favor that afternoon. Sandra left without speaking to either of us. Her attorney indicated she was considering an appeal. Edward's attorney said she had no viable grounds. In the car going home, we didn't talk. We were on the highway, the river visible through the trees, when Edward said quietly, "You didn't have to say all of that." "I know. The year is up in 3 weeks." "I know." "Ruth." He kept his eyes on the road. "I don't want to file the divorce papers." I looked at him. "I understand if you want to go home," he said. I understand if I was always just a means to an end. You saved Caleb, and that's what you came here to do. I'm not trying to renegotiate anything." His voice was very careful. "But I want to tell you the truth, which is that this year has been the first time in a very long time that I felt like a person who might deserve to still be here. And I don't know what to do with that except tell you." I watched the river through the trees. "I came here for Caleb," I said. "That's true." I paused. "I'm staying for me." He exhaled slowly. It was the most unguarded thing I'd ever seen him do. We didn't renew vows or have a ceremony. That's not who either of us is. We signed a new agreement, not a contract, just a document we drew up together that said we were choosing this deliberately, without financial compulsion, in full knowledge of each other. We had it notarized on a Thursday morning, and then went to breakfast at the diner in town, the one with the good biscuits, and sat across from each other like ordinary people. Donna brought Caleb to meet Edward for the first time that Christmas. Caleb walked in and immediately asked Edward if he could see the whole house, and Edward said yes, and they disappeared for 45 minutes. They came back with Caleb explaining something about the load-bearing walls, which Edward had apparently been describing to him. Caleb is 10 now. He still wants to be an astronaut, but lately he's also interested in building things. He asks Edward a lot of questions at dinner. Edward answers all of them. Donna is doing her dental hygiene certification upgrade. She's taking night classes. She called me last week to say she'd gotten a scholarship. I found out later Edward had directed the application to a foundation he helps fund, without telling either of us, and without putting his name on it. I told him I knew what he'd done. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't push it. Miriam still runs the house, but she lets me make decisions about it now too, which I suspect was her choice more than Edward's. She says it feels different here. I know what she means. It's not a museum anymore. It's a house where someone fell asleep on the library couch last week with a book on her chest, and someone else came in and put a blanket over her without waking her up and left a glass of water on the side table. Edward still wears the gloves sometimes. In public, always. At home, less and less. His hands will never be what they were, but he holds his coffee cup without them now in the mornings. And sometimes when we're sitting in the library in the evening, he'll reach over and turn a page in my book, because I've got the throw blanket tucked around me and he can do it and I can't. And he does it so naturally I almost forget every complicated thing that had to happen to get us here. I was 63 years old when I answered a letter from a stranger because I was desperate and terrified and I had a grandson who needed a heart. I didn't expect to find one of my own. But that's the thing about people who've been hurt into silence. Sometimes all they need is someone willing to sit on the floor with them at 3 in the morning and not look away. Not fix everything, just not look away. I've been a teacher long enough to know that's most of what any of us need. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually takes to change the direction of a life. Not the big dramatic moments. Those are easy to point to. I mean the quiet ones. The choice to get up off the floor. The choice to hold out your hand even when you're not sure it'll be taken. When I drove up to Whitmore House that first time, I thought I was doing one thing. Surviving. Getting money for Caleb. That was the whole equation. I wasn't looking for anything else, and I didn't expect to find it. What I've come to understand, looking back, is that you almost never find the thing you most need by going looking for it directly. You find it by showing up somewhere hard and paying attention. Edward had spent 22 years in a kind of self-imposed sentence. A girl died. He had made a decision under pressure that he should have made differently, and he knew it. And instead of finding a way to live with that honestly, he buried himself in it. The gloves. The silence, the house on the bluff with no visitors. He thought isolation was the same as accountability. I've seen that confusion before. In students, in people I've loved. This idea that if you make yourself small enough and invisible enough, you've somehow evened the score. You haven't. You just disappeared. And disappearing doesn't help anyone. What changed wasn't one conversation. It wasn't me saying the right thing on that office floor at 3 in the morning, though I'd like to think it mattered. What changed was that he let someone stay close enough to see the truth of him, and the truth turned out to be survivable. That's the thing about carrying something alone for too long. It grows in the dark. You start to believe the weight of it is proof of how bad you are, when really it's just proof of how long you've been alone with it. I'm not a therapist. I'm a retired schoolteacher from Portland who signed a contract out of desperation. But 34 years in a classroom teaches you something about what people actually need, and it's almost never what they say they need. Edward didn't need someone to tell him he was forgiven. He needed someone to sit across from him and not flinch. To say, I see what you did, I see what it cost, and I'm still here. Caleb had open heart surgery at 9 years old and came out the other side asking questions about load-bearing walls. That's who he is. He met a man with scarred hands and a house full of books and immediately wanted to understand how things were built. There's something in that I keep coming back to. This instinct children have to look at something complicated and ask how it works instead of whether it's safe to touch. I think about the choices that built the life I have now, and they were not the choices I thought I was making at the time. I thought I was making a deal. I was actually deciding, without knowing it, to stop shrinking. To stop being only a grandmother, only a widow, only someone in crisis. To take up space in a life I hadn't planned for. The debt Edward felt. I understand it. I felt smaller versions of it. Moments in my career where I didn't fight hard enough for a student I could see was struggling. Times I chose the easier conversation over the necessary one. What I know is that guilt is only useful for as long as it points you towards something better. After that, it's just weight. And carrying weight that no longer serves anyone is not virtue, it's habit. Edward volunteers now, he doesn't perform. He shows up and he tells young engineers, the pressure you're feeling to cut corners is real and it will keep being real. And here is what it cost me when I gave in to it. That's not penance anymore. That's wisdom. There's a difference, and it took both of us a long time to learn it. I married a stranger to save my grandson's life. I stayed because I recognized in him the same thing I've always recognized in the people worth staying for, someone who, underneath all the damage, was still trying. That's enough. That has always been enough.